So it's been a bit of a Charlie Brown Christmas month presentation. And if you've been following along, 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, we talked about the wise guys, referring to the Magi that came to see Jesus probably somewhere a year or two after he was born. Last week we talked about misfits, which was shepherds. And this morning we're talking about the Mangy Manger. So it's a bit of the Charlie Brown Christmas, but Merry Christmas to all of you. As was last Sunday's lesson, again, I'm kind of camping on Luke chapter 2. It's one of my more favorite passages, especially this time of the year. Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 12. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby. They were keeping watch over their flocks at night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid, because I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all of the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Have you ever heard the expression, "Were you born in a barn"? Have you heard that expression before? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I did a little research on that subject, and I found that there are two prevailing theories as to how that phrase had its origin. The first was from a blog that I read, and it's written by a woman named Amanda Thompson. And Amanda Thompson suggested that originally the phrase was, "Were you born in Bardney?" Now, Neil in particular will appreciate this little bit of historicity, because Bardney is the site of the Tupholme Abbey in Lincolnshire, England. And apparently, years after the king, his name was Saint Oswald, was killed in 642, his niece, Osthryth, moved his bones to that particular abbey. Unfortunately, the good monks at the abbey refused to have the king interred there, since although he was known to be a really godly man, he was also what they referred to as a foreign king. And thus, being a foreign king, shouldn't be interred in this particular abbey. During the night, however, according to the story, a pillar of light shone up from the cart that was carrying St. Oswald's bones up into the heavens, convincing the monks that Oswald was indeed a saint and that they'd been wrong to shut him out and not bring the cart inside with his remains. So legend has it that forever thereafter, the monks left their gates wide open. As a result, the phrase that developed, "Were you born in Bardney?" meant that you'd left the door open. Okay, that's the first theory. It's also possible that the phrase's original question was, in fact, "Were you born in a barn?" Long ago, it was a custom to leave the barn doors open in the early morning hours to let the cows go out and graze in the pasture, and they would stay open all day until the cows were herded back into the barn for milking, again in the early evening, hence leaving the door open. I first heard the phrase when I tracked mud in the house. Jesus, just look at the mess. Were you born in a Oh, forget it. Now, my youngest son, William, was born in what they called at the time a birthing suite. He had the good fortune of being born at a time when birthing suites were kind of the vogue. And maybe you've been in one, maybe you've seen one. It's one of those really comfortable, really clean, warm, and brightly lit rooms where the entire family can be present for the birth, surrounded by the latest technology. It was exactly the sort of place where you'd want your baby to be born. But when we think about Jesus, not so much. He wasn't born in some sort of immaculate birthing suite. He was born in a barn and laid in a manger. And a manger is where they feed animals. And the question for me that I'm posing to you is, why? Of all the places that Jesus could have been born, why was he born in a barn with a manger as his cradle? Now, you know me, I ponder these kinds of things, especially during this time of the year, and maybe it's because I was born in a barn. I don't know, but that's just where my mind goes. But it did get me to thinking about this. Maybe Jesus was born in a barn and laid in a manger to fulfill Scripture. You know, the prophecies in the Old Testament predicting Jesus' coming. The problem is, there are no prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah being born in a barn. So there went that theory. So then I thought, well, maybe it's because Jesus was always called the Good Shepherd, right? Maybe he was born in a place that was cut out for shepherds, like we talked about last Sunday. Now, it's true that shepherds would often take shelter out in the fields, like in a stable, for instance, to avoid the elements. But that kind of place was usually a cave of some sort, and shepherds didn't live there. They just took shelter there from time to time. And they certainly didn't give birth there. Shepherds may have been religious and social outcasts, like we talked about last week, and among them they were certainly the poorest of the poor, but even a shepherd wouldn't be born in a barn. Sorry, a manger. And then it came to me. The obvious answer to my question is provided by the story itself. Jesus was born in a barn and placed in a manger because there was no room at the inn. Remember that story? And then I thought, that's it. That is the answer to the question. It wasn't something that was planned. It was an accident. And Jesus was a preemie. That's why he was born in a barn and laid in a manger. But then I got to thinking about that theory, and that in the life of Christ, there were never any accidents. Everything was planned, down to the last detail kind of planned. Planned before the beginning of time kind of planned. So, if all that's true, then why would Jesus be laid in a manger? Well, if you take stock of a real manger, a few things kind of stand out. First, a manger can be extremely cold. And if you subscribe to Jesus being born during an Israeli winter, it's that damp, kind of sort of cold that just chills you to the bone. Further, the only heat source available in a manger would have come from the body heat from the cows and their breath. Thank you. But in the winter, their breath would have made a cloud of steam that, given the right conditions, would have probably frozen in midair. And a manger is also very dark. In fact, most mangers were located underground in a cave, kind of like what you see here, or below the house that the manger served. So even when the sun is shining, it's dark inside a manger. And perhaps stating the obvious, a manger is filthy. It's full of slobber and drool and mud and dust and cobwebs and other stuff. And as a result of all of that, it smells really bad. There's no such thing as a clean or hygienic manger. But at Christmas time, however, we tend to romanticize the manger. And thanks to Dale, he provided this to us several years ago. And this is what you see typically behind me. You know, it's the Magi coming on the camels, and it's Joseph, and it's Mary, and it's Jesus in a little cradle, and we have, sheep and other kind of animals, and we've tend to romanticize the birth of Christ. We turn it into something that's beautiful and heavenly, and that's okay. It's kind of like the first century birthing suite of sorts. But a real manger isn't like that. The truth is that Jesus was laid in a place that was cold, dark, dirty, and smelly. But again, why? Because if Jesus was God incarnate, if Jesus was God with skin on, or Emmanuel, meaning God with us, couldn't he have picked a better spot than a filthy feeding trough or a mangy manger? And then it occurred to me, maybe, just maybe, it's because Jesus is always born in a manger. And here's my thinking. You see, when Jesus comes into our lives, he's born in a manger of sorts because the human heart, tragically, is just like a mangy manger. Our hearts are cold because we don't know the love of God. Our hearts are dark because we don't have the light of Christ in us or the hope of salvation. And our hearts are dirty because we are stained and we are soiled by sin. But the miracle of Christmas is that Jesus is willing to be born into the hearts just like that. No matter how cold, no matter how dark, no matter how dirty our hearts may be, Jesus is willing to come in and to be born in the manger of our lives. His birth and where he laid reminds us that Jesus always meets us at the manger. He encounters us in that place where we feel utterly lost and hopeless and helpless. He meets us in the darkness of our grief and of our sorrow. He meets us in the blackness of our despair. He comes into our lives when we feel unloved and unlovable, and sometimes even alone. When inside we feel cold and half frozen to death, Jesus meets us in all of the mess and all of the filth of our sin, even those sins which we think are not forgivable. As maybe you've heard, Anne Rice She passed away this past week. She was a very famous novelist. Her books have sold over 100 million copies the world over. Most of Anne Rice's books dealt with the occult and with vampires, like Interview with the Vampire and Queen of the Damned. Both of those books were the subject of film adaptations. Tragically, when Anne was very young, her mother died, and as a result, Anne grew up fearful of the dark. Later on, Anne got married and gave birth to a sweet baby girl named Michelle. But when Michelle was just 2 years old, she died of leukemia. Crushed, Anne began drinking heavily, and she sank into a very, very deep depression. And as Anne's means of therapy, she began writing. And she began writing about vampires because vampires, so they say, are able to live forever. Her novels brought Anne Rice unimaginable wealth and fame, so much so that she bought a huge mansion in New Orleans and entertained her many guests with these really lavish parties. She subsequently sold that and moved out to Cathedral City, which is out in the Palm Springs area, and that's where Anne passed away this past week. But then a really strange thing happened to Anne Rice. Anne began reading her Bible again. Now, as a young girl, she'd been raised in the Catholic Church, and so she was familiar with God and familiar with Jesus and familiar with His Word. And even though she hadn't been to church for decades, she felt this strange longing to take communion, she said. Then in 1998, she renewed her faith in Jesus Christ, and in 2005 decided that she would no longer write about vampires. Describing the moment, here's what Anne Rice said. I was in church talking to the Lord saying, I want everything I do to be for you. And then it hit me. It will be for you, all of it, every word. So it should come as no surprise that when her autobiography, Called Out of Darkness, a spiritual confession that she wrote in 2008, when it was released, it rocked the publishing world. It was bordering on the inconceivable that Anne Rice, the queen of the vampires, was a renewed believer in Jesus Christ. But then again, maybe it shouldn't surprise us because Jesus is always born in the manger of dark and cold and dirty hearts that long to be called out of darkness and into His light, out of bondage and into freedom, out of fear and into joy, out of self and into Christ. So, wrapping it up, maybe being born in a barn isn't so bad after all. I encourage you to have a blessed Christmas and a blessed Christmas week leading up to it. I hope for most of you that most of the shopping is done. There might be a few little odds and ends here that need to be purchased, but I hope most of that has been done and that you can actually enjoy this coming week as we as a church And we as a community, and we as a nation, and we as a world celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. So to each of you, from Curtis and myself, Merry Christmas. Let's keep Christ in Christmas because, as the saying goes, that is the reason for the season.